Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
My name is Stephanie Fassler, and I'm the International Affairs Director for the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. On behalf of the Council, I welcome you to this evening's Foreign Policy Panel and World Affairs Today program, The State of the Union's Foreign Policy. On January 20th, President Barack Obama delivered the annual State of the Union address to the joint houses of Congress. In it, he outlined not only domestic policy objectives, but also those related to America's foreign policy. Joining us this evening is a distinguished panel to look at some of the policy points President Obama raised, and maybe some that he didn't. Starting off our panel, Andrew Weiss is the residing Vice President for Studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and a Senior Advisor at the Albright Stonebridge Group. He was previously the Director of the Ukrainian, Russian, and Eurasian Affairs on the National Security Staff before he became a member of the State Department's Policy Planning Staff. He then served as the director of the RAND Corporation's Center for Russia and Eurasia. Danielle Pletka is the Senior Vice President of Foreign and Defense Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. Before serving in AEI, she was a staff member of the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations. She frequently writes on national security matters, specifically the Middle East, East and South Asia. Kathleen Hicks is Senior Vice President, Director of the International Security Program, and Henry A. Kissinger Chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. She was a senior official in the Department of Defense and a deputy under the Secretary of Defense. Her focus is on defense policies and strategies on a global scale. Dr. James Carafano is Vice President for the Heritage Foundation and its Kathryn and Shelby Coleman Davis Institute for National Security and Foreign Policy. Previous to his current role, he served as the director of the Douglas and Sarah Allison Center for Foreign Policy Studies at the Davis Institute. He concentrates on national security, foreign, and defense policies. Moderating this evening's panel is Mr. Tony Colley-Foster, President and CEO of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Previously, he established the CFCO International, a business consultancy, and also was the director of the Boys and Girls Club of Chicago. He's also a founding chairman of the Northern Ireland Partnership, USA and Northern Ireland, United States Chamber of Commerce. Please join me in welcoming this evening's panel.
Well, we had a discussion in the back room in terms of what order this panel should be addressed in tonight, and we had suggested alphabetical. However, a wise man here from Italy, whose name came up first, said, let's go biblical. The last shall be first and the first shall be last. So Andrew here is going to take the first question. And Andrew, like most of the people in this audience, we were glued to our television sets last night. I'm not sure how many were glued to the Republican rebuttal, but in terms of President Obama's bullish address to the United States last night, was there anything in terms of foreign policy that wasn't included, that should have been included in that debate?
Well, it's funny. I was just talking with one of your colleagues before we got started about the sense that this administration is facing a pretty tough 2 years in its final stretch and how unpredictable that period is likely to be. And so it's I think, for any of us, I think it's a very humbling role to serve in government because you're constantly barraged by unanticipated problems, and those are the problems that are the most urgent oftentimes. I believe that what we heard last night is one more attempt by the president to sort of lay out a vision of what he believes is sort of a smarter foreign policy strategy. He used the sort of code word for smart power as opposed to using military force to solve most of our problems. What I didn't hear from him, and I think all of us need to think about this is just how much the U.S. role in the world is changing. And relative to other powers around the world, there are plenty of actors, state actors, non-state actors, who clearly don't agree with what the U.S. vision is for the world and also want a greater say over how the international system is shaped. And what I think we constantly feel, and sort of, I say this as someone who works on foreign policy issues professionally, is a desire to kind of put all this toothpaste back in the tube and kind of get back to this more orderly world that we all dealt with in the post-Cold War period, where U.S. leadership was generally unchallenged and the U.S. was kind of this preeminent force in the world. Clearly there's just no way to go back to that, but you hear a lot of, at least I hear a lot of descriptions of what the administration is thinking a lot of times behind the scenes is they just kind of want the status quo. They kind of want to sort of persist in, keep this thing together. And I think that's going to be really challenging. And I think that's not an easy thing. It's not a bumper sticker for foreign policy. It's not something any president wants to admit, that the problems may overwhelm our grasp or our capacity to fix things. And it's obviously not going to be the rhetoric during a political campaign where everyone wants to say, I can do better than Obama or I can be different from Obama. But it makes me very worried that, as we see with Ebola, we generally, I think, were able to mount a pretty quick response. We were able to be decisive. I'm not sure that's been the case with ISIS. I'm pretty confident it hasn't been. Certainly hasn't been the case with what Russia's been doing in Ukraine. We can pretend we've put things in a box, or we can pretend that these problems are going to just kind of be, they'll deal, as the president said last night, we've stood resolute in the face of Russian aggression in Ukraine, and it's all, now just we're going to watch Putin squirm as his economy unravels and things like that. It was very strident kind of talk. I'm not sure that's the case. I kind of think throughout the Russia crisis, which is the piece I know best, Putin has controlled the pace of escalation, and he's shown that he's willing to pay a fairly high price to accomplish the goals that he has in Ukraine. And what we've seen in the West is we're not willing to pay a high price. We're basically going to use sanctions or other tools to isolate Russia. But we certainly aren't going to get involved militarily. We certainly aren't even willing to cough up some of the financial resources to keep Ukraine afloat. And so we end up, and this is where I'll stop, with this timing mismatch in our Russia policy where we've expressed really high-minded, important views, which is aggression against smaller countries shouldn't be countenanced, and can't redraw borders by force, and you can't act this way in the 21st century. But the reality is that Putin just keeps acting that way, and there isn't a lot to stop him. And so, short of going to war, short of some form of direct military support for the Ukrainians, which I assume some of the other folks on the panel may come out in favor of, we're going to stay in this very volatile spot where over the last couple of days we've seen a slide back to increased levels of violence in eastern Ukraine, and this is during the winter. This is during the most forbidding period of the year, and who knows what's going to await us in the spring or the summer when people are going to have more freedom to do things militarily.
Thank you very much. I think that's a good, cogent answer to a direct question. And I would like to open that same question up to the rest of the panel, beginning with Danielle.
Well, that was a very sort of genteel way of putting the way the president characterized things last night. I mean, I think the thing that troubled a lot of people who care about foreign policy is that the president didn't spend a lot of time talking about foreign policy, and that the way he characterized a lot of the challenges that we face, I think, are a little bit consonant with how he would like them to be, but not how they actually are. And while that's fine if you work in a think tank, which we all do, it's a little bit more troubling when you're the President of the United States. In fact, you're exactly right. I think that Putin has been in the driver's seat, notwithstanding the rather weak hand he has. We have a tendency to talk about Russia, and I'll only address this very quickly because my area is the Middle East and terrorism and things like that. But we have a tendency to talk about Russia as if Russia was the Soviet Union, and I think that's very much the way Putin likes us to talk about Russia. But of course, actually, Russia isn't the Soviet Union. Maybe the Soviet Union wasn't even the Soviet Union by the end. But Putin is rather a tin pot dictator with unpleasant ambitions and retrograde ideas. And yet, it's not just that we've not been willing to engage militarily. I don't think there's anyone, in fact, I would go so far as to say there isn't anyone who has suggested that we do so, but that we haven't been willing to do really the minimum things necessary to help the Ukrainians, including helping them arm themselves. We've been unwilling to provide lethal assistance to them, and I think that goes to another question, and it helps frame perhaps a little bit of the other way that I see the challenges that were ignored or well, no, mostly ignored by the president last night. Not everything is a question of doing nothing or war, or wonderful negotiations that lead to peace in our time and smart power and war. In fact, there are lots and lots and lots of other tools in the president's toolbox that seem, how shall I say it, just sort of uninteresting to him. And this sort of brings us over to the question of how he characterized the fight against ISIS. I mean, guess what, guys? The fight against ISIS is going really badly. They retook a major city in Iraq last week. The president didn't mention that, Beirut. A very significant cohort of opposition leaders in Syria pledged fealty to ISIS yesterday. Things are not going well. Now again, ISIS, a similar problem. ISIS is not 10 feet tall. ISIS is not, it's not even Russia. But we have had a sort of a day late and a dollar short approach to it that has resulted in them taking ground and territory that will ultimately represent a threat to us. And the biggest problem about not having a forward-leaning posture, and I think the president does not have a forward-leaning posture, and I agree, he would like things to, you said it was the status quo, not a great bumper sticker. Boy, are you right about that. But I think it's sort of, you know, just be off the front page. This really isn't my priority. Don't interfere with my agenda, which doesn't relate to national security. And the problem is that when you do that, when you hold yourself back, other people get to dictate what you do. By beheading one of your citizens in the scope of things, hardly terrible, but extraordinarily meaningful to the American people when they see it. And it causes you to act, but you're acting on a timeline dictated by Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. I mean, really? He's the person who should be dictating what we do in the region? The last thing, and then I'll turn things over, is on the question of Iran. And there I think that the president, I think he spoke from the heart, a vile expression that we tend to use in Washington to mean that someone is sincere. But what I mean is that I think he genuinely believes that things are going well in the negotiations with Iran about Iran's nuclear weapons program. And the challenge is, of course, that we have a Congress that is controlled by the Republican Party in both the House and Senate, and they don't agree. And what they've set in place is the possibility of a bill to be passed that will sanction Iran, not now, not anytime soon, but at the end of the negotiating process between the administration and some of our allies and the Iranians, but effectively between us and Tehran. And the president came up and he said, I'm going to veto that. And he really kind of said that passionately, actually. And I think that he set himself up in opposition to a Democratic and a Republican group of members that very strongly disagree. It was an interesting choice to make, to challenge them in some ways on behalf of Iran, I guess, but even more on behalf of a policy that doesn't seem to be working that well. And that was really, to come back to where I started, was the biggest problem with the national security parts of this speech, was that they didn't really match up to the facts on the ground. So I'll leave it at that, and then perhaps we can talk later.
Kathleen?
Sure. Let me start with what I thought was good, and then I'll get to the part you asked about what was missing. You know, first of all, on the good, I think the president said some things that were important to say in a State of the Union about foreign policy. The first, although many of these things, as others have pointed out, foreign policy was a small piece, so some of these are in passing. But if you're reading in a Talmudic sense, he does reaffirm that the United States needs to lead in the world. He makes this point about it's not a question of whether, but how. I think that's important. That's something people have criticized the president for, this idea of leading from behind, and he again rhetorically makes this point about the importance of leadership. And similarly, for those of us who work on defense and national security, he reaffirms the right that the United States has always retained and that he continues to retain to act unilaterally when and where he believes it in the U.S. interest. So I think that was very important to state and always to have out there in front of us. I think, again, rhetorically, he makes a strong point about trying to think strategically and the importance contrasting his understanding of how he executes his foreign policy with what he believes is the way the Bush administration, particularly the first term of Bush 43, how they executed on Iraq. He makes this point about using our heads and not acting rashly, and I think that's something the American people put him in office for, and that resonates with people, the idea that he takes use of force very seriously and he's thinking hard about blood and treasure when he's making foreign policy decisions. I think the call for the authorization for the use of military force versus ISIS was very important to make. There's a lot more to that debate that doesn't really weigh in his favor in terms of how and when. There has been a push on that. I'll save that for the bad, but raise it now. And I'll say on Cuba, I think Cuba is a hugely positive initiative. I think it's good that the president reiterated it in the State of the Union, called attention to it, and made the point that when we have policies that have failed for a long period of time, it's time to try something new and be innovative. This is a policy change that really only a second-term president post-midterm could do. It's great that he took the initiative in foreign policy to do that. And then finally on Iran, rhetorically, he said a lot of the right things. He made this point about a unique window of opportunity for diplomacy, but that all options remain on the table, which is very important for people to hear. And I think his point about the veto, again, I agree that it's strong, but I thought it was important that he put out there, he made very clear how difficult that will make things if that conversation proceeds right now during the midst of the negotiations. And finally, Gitmo. I thought it was important that he reiterated his continued emphasis on Gitmo. I think that's a closing of Gitmo. I think that's something that got lost in the middle, kind of from around 2012 to 2014. It was very quiet. So I think the fact that he's coming back at the end to try to continue to pursue that goal is important. Now, what didn't go well in the speech? First of all, I thought the tone on foreign policy in particular was off. I liked that the president talked in the speech about what I would call a post-partisan world. I thought that was very effective. But he didn't miss an opportunity to put his digs in. He made a specific dig at Senator McCain, quoting him without saying that's who he was quoting, but everybody knows that's who he was quoting, and referencing bluster. He also, in the course of talking about the importance of cyber, which was very good and timely, he talked about Congress needing to finally pass cyber legislation. Again, I don't think he missed an opportunity to sort of, despite having the post-partisan rhetoric, to go back into the partisanship. And of course, if you watch the speech, you will remember the part where some people impolitely clapped when he indicated he wasn't going to run again, but he didn't miss the opportunity to indicate it's because he had won twice. And I think that, to me, was a moment where his prior points about his cool-headedness and the ability to think strategically and long-term and not be rash was really undermined by the very nature of the kinds of things he said in the speech, which I thought was unfortunate. I think the president's better than that. I think he's a stronger person than that. Other people have pointed to some comments he made that fit in this category. He, I think, continues to have the habit of declaring victory too early. Yemen is an obvious example that blessedly did not come up in the State of the Union, which would have been very awkward given events in Yemen in the last day. But Russia was very noticeable on this point. I personally believe Russia is, in trouble in the long term. Its demographics, its economy, its kleptocracy all work against it in the long term. And that the U.S. has stronger fundamentals. That doesn't mean, as the president said, that those people who believed we should have been more forceful or who don't believe we are on a path to victory now are foolish. So I didn't care for that tone, and I thought it was wrong. I thought another example of that, of course, was Iraq and Syria with reference to ISIS. It was downright inaccurate on Syria when he made the reference to rolling back advances of ISIS. And I think it behooves us to be much more circumspect about the future of Iraq than to declare victory today. And of course, it would have been a great opportunity for him to reiterate really excellent points he made this summer in pushing the Iraqis to make the kind of political progress they need to make inside Iraq to get the secure future that they're looking for. The big missing elements, the defense budget. And even if you don't care about the defense budget, the fact that he talked about the importance of diplomacy and using all our tools of power and the intelligence community and cyber, you ought to have a national security budget that supports that. And of course, under sequestration, we don't have that. Sequestration wasn't even mentioned, which is glaring, glaring oversight. China and India, there is a passing reference to the rebalance, but no real mention of China, no mention at all of India, no even whiff of a mention of India, both of which are incredibly important for the future. Both potentially very positive, India certainly very positive, and China very complicated and ought to be a highlight of what he's talking about in foreign policy. Syria itself, I think there was this clumping of Iraq and Syria on ISIS. That's the lens being applied today, even in the media. It's not just the president, to issues in Syria, but we obviously have a massive problem in terms of what the heck international policy ought to be on Syria, vis-a-vis the Assad regime and ISIS, humanitarian disaster, foreign fighters. None of that came up in this speech. My bottom line, though, is what the president says matters, and the rhetoric matters, but in the 6th year of an administration, what matters more than anything else is execution, and I think that's what the American people are looking for. So, good to pick apart the State of the Union, it matters, but in the long term, what really matters is what gets done in these next 2 years on these issues.
Wow, I find myself in a really awkward place. I think I'm the most positive about the speech of anybody, which is freaking me out here. So I want to defend the president's speech because I don't think he had a lot of options. I think Kat actually framed it well. So there's kind of 3 baskets, and he did what you would expect the president to do in each of those. So there are the kind of the platitudes baskets, you know, we love our veterans, we love our soldiers, you know, we're going to defend the country. Things you can find in every presidential State of the Union address, and if they weren't there, people would just scratch their head. So that's fair. On you know, kind of the one over the world crises, really, what would you expect the president to say? I mean, if he started to kind of go through each one of those crises and explain how they weren't really not working, there wouldn't have been time left for anything else in the speech. And so he said what you would expect the president to say is, I got the con on this, and I'll take care of it, right? We could debate whether that's true or not, but what else really could he say? Because he couldn't not mention them, and he couldn't not mention foreign policy, so he did that. And then he had to talk about Iran and Cuba, because literally those are the only 2 foreign policy initiatives, and other than trade, we can talk about trade, those are the only 2 Obama foreign policy initiatives we have on the table. Now, and of course he's got to talk about them and defend them. Now, I personally think they are failures in waiting, and I completely disagree with Kat that these are good things. But what else could he say? So here's what I would have said. There was an opportunity for him to go to a place, to a safe house, a safe place, where he wouldn't have gotten a lot of pushback, and where he could have seemed incredibly proactive, and where it wouldn't have been a huge lift, and where it would have actually been enormously helpful. Almost no discussion in the speech about allies and friends in the world. Huge opportunities there. And I'll just really quickly go through 4 that he could have mentioned. You could start in Asia, US, Japan, Korea. Absolutely vital. Korea and Japan are America's anchor in Asia. If we don't have Japan and Korea, we're not an Asian power. Japan and Korea have some issues. Getting the United States, Japan, and Korea to work together, there are a few things more important. That's something he could have talked about, something the United States can do a lot about. It's a very constructive, positive thing to talk about. Could have talked about that. The United States, Japan, Australia, and India. If we have a common approach to how we deal with, if only with Chinese territorial claims, this is about containment, but just in how the region leadership reacts to Chinese territorial claims, hugely helpful. There was an initiative called the Quad, which started several years ago and kind of died a quiet death. A lot of people have been talking about bringing it back. President's going to India. So talking about the Quad, Japan, Australia, India working together, huge opportunity, didn't talk about. The other 2, I think, are a little more problematic. Who are our friends in the Middle East? Where is the firebreak? Where is the alliance of stability that the United States is seeking to build so we don't have to go back and invade countries again? And I think there are lots of things you could talk about. You can start with countries like Tunisia, which are small, but the birthplace of the Arab Spring, one of the few places that we're making progress, really super popular, wanting to be popular with the United States. Go through Morocco, very key, into Egypt, where I think the president, you know, I think he's got to accept Sisi at face value for now, and there's got to be a working partnership there. Jordan, who's been a small but very, very important country. Israel, that's a key ally. Then you go far north, it gets a little more problematic because you got Iraq and Kurdistan. And then, of course, there's always Turkey. But you can craft a vision of an alliance of strong bilateral relationships that could be the anchor of stability and economic freedom and growth in the Middle East. Opportunity missed. And then I think in Europe, I think you've got to talk about starting with the UK, which is our anchor to Europe, much the way China, Japan and Korea are anchored in Asia, and then go through where are we really gonna get stability in Western Europe in regards to Russia and in the future of NATO. And I really think it's from the Nordic to the Baltic to the Central European countries. A lot we could do there. Could talk about NATO expansion. That would make the Russians happy. They hate us anyway, and they actually trashed the Obama speech anyway. So I think those are 4 areas. We could argue about the individual countries and the nature of the alliances, but where the president could have done a wonderful speech and never said the word Libya or Syria or Iraq or any of those things, and demonstrated a positive vision that, quite honestly, I don't think there's a conservative in the Congress that wouldn't have stood and applauded, talking about building positive relationships with those countries. So I think it was an opportunity, a real opportunity missed.
I'm from Northern Ireland. My father comes from the Republic of Ireland. My mother comes from the north of Ireland. My father is Catholic. My mother is Protestant. We had a war for 37 years that took place in the north of Ireland and the border counties. The United States is beginning to face up to an extension of the type of conflict that we tried to resolve over there. It took us 37 years. It's called the War on Terror. What about bring back our girls? Where have they gone? That's a year. Okay. What about ISIS and the expansion of its control? There doesn't appear to be any rollback on ISIS activities. And before we go to the Middle East, let's talk a little bit about Russia and Ukraine. I'd like to know from this distinguished panel what they feel that America and its allies, and it would be great if you could name some of them, could tangibly do, either through constructive engagement, diplomacy, armed intervention, whatever option you think, in terms of a resolution of the seizure of sovereign territory in the Ukraine by another sovereign nation called the Russian Federation. That was a question.
Sure. Okay. Well, we're almost at the 1-year anniversary of the Ukraine Revolution that occurred in third week of February 2014, and I think we're probably worse off today than we were about a year ago. We've got a Ukraine which is on the brink of financial collapse. It has a hot conflict in a large part of its country in the southeastern region. Crimea is basically seen, even by Poroshenko, the president of Ukraine, in his most recent interviews, as kind of being a topic we'll deal with some significant time in the future, and he's kind of separated out the status of Crimea and possible claims Ukraine can present on the future for reunification with Crimea as a long-term problem. And the urgent problem is, what do we do about this mess in eastern Ukraine? As best I can tell, the Western policy on this has been largely focused on let's punish Putin, let's get under his skin, we'll apply sanctions, we will isolate Russia, we will make Putin feel like he's the odd man out of the international system. But as we talked about a few moments ago, there's real limits to how much blood and treasure or activity the U.S. and its allies are willing to engage in to promote either a reconciliation between these two countries, which are going to have to live together, which have been living together for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And then most importantly to me, there's been a real lack of focus on supporting Ukrainian reform. And so the big play here is a country like Ukraine, which has had terrible problems throughout its period of independence since 1991, which has had all the kleptocracy, corruption, internal division, decent record of being a democracy for periods of its independence since 91. But it is in real trouble. And what do we have in the West? We have a lot of disagreement about who has to pay for this. We have no real person in charge of the U.S. government. There's no point person you could say today who's, just as General Allen is the coordinator on ISIS policy, there isn't like a coordinator or lead person in the U.S. government. There isn't a similar designated person in the European establishment. And to my mind, there is this mismatch, which is Russia will, as Kath was saying a few minutes ago, have some long-term challenges. The sanctions aggravate those and intensify those. But the problems Ukraine faces today are acute. And we could end up in a situation very easily to imagine within the 2 years remaining of the president's term of office in which this reformist Ukraine basically dies on the operating table. And we get something worse, which is state, unraveling. We get the country being kind of divided into feudal zones. We get some sort of new popular uprising. Ukraine's had a couple of those in its post-Soviet history. Or we get more military conflict, more sort of direct military conflict between Russia and Ukraine. All of those things could happen on the president's watch. And so I think everyone in the policy system in both Europe and the United States is, well-meaning and they say the right things, but when it comes to delivering, as Kath said, and executing, they haven't really done it. They've expended most of their energy on sanctions. I think sanctions have been a kind of cop-out because they make people feel like we're doing something and you can point to it and it's personalized and we've said this is aimed at Putin and his inner circle, or we're going to hurt those Russian state-owned companies that are dens of corruption or whatever bad phenomena we're trying to address. But they don't deal with this core problem, which is that Ukrainian sort of reformist, Western-oriented, free to choose their own way, that is something that Putin doesn't want. And he seems to be willing to expend a lot of energy to snuff it out. And we talk about wanting to promote Ukraine's integration into Europe and to making it part of the European mainstream. It's not clear there's much receptivity for that in major European capitals. I haven't seen that that's become a cardinal principle for the Germans, the French, the Italians, the Brits. It's much more a core principle for Ukraine's immediate neighbors. So we're in this spot where we have a country that people claim they all want to help, and they're willing to do it on the cheap. They're willing to, in the case of the diplomacy, subcontract it to the Europeans, who so far have shown themselves, well-meaning but unable to deliver on a ceasefire or some form of de-escalation.
Just now, they just announced a de-escalation.
Yeah, but again, if you read it pretty closely, it's it's old wine and new balls, or things people have agreed to do in the past.
Easy to de-escalate when the temperature drops.
And again, it just comes back to, well, we're doing stuff, we're sanctioning people, we're hurting, we're isolating, and I think what Putin has shown us time and again is he's willing to take a lot of pain, and now that he's the international bad guy, he's actually willing to act like the bad guy, and that is a challenge for the international system that we haven't really seen. And as much as people like to say, oh, Russia's got these, real long-term challenges, like he's able to deploy military or intelligence assets to dismantle his neighbor, and people are kind of basically saying bad doggy, but they're not really willing to do much about it.
Does anyone disagree with the assessment that what the administration thinks is that Putin is, because of the constraints on the economy, that he's less dangerous and now less of a top-tier concern for them? Anybody disagree with that?
I probably disagree. I think the problem on Russia policy is more one of confusion. I don't know that that's any better, but I don't think, you know what I mean? But I don't think it's like, a view that is a problem taken care of. Again, the rhetoric sounds that way, and I do sometimes worry that there is this view that it's, Russia's on this inevitable decline, and if we just sit back, it will collapse unto itself. But not all powers, as we all know, go down easy. And this is a nuclear-armed power, very dangerous power. And to go back to something Andrew said at the very, very beginning, which is the changing nature of the types of threats we're looking at, when you look at Russia today, the threats that we face, of course we still face the extant threats, nuclear weapons, conventional power, but what we've seen them deploy recently in this particular series of crises is a mix of cyber, the potential at least for energy, if not use of energy as a weapon, absolutely subversion of democratic institutions, whether it's Ukraine or even NATO states where we know they're supporting political parties for the purposes of being subversive and altering the cohesion of reducing the cohesion of NATO. And then, of course, there's the little green men. Even at the military level, in other words, they're trying to come in below the threshold at which use of force is applicable. Saying all that, use of force, therefore, in a traditional way, is probably not the best tool that the West has at this point for that type of threat. So I think one of the good things the administration actually did in the spring and summer and continuing today is the effort to reassure NATO to actually deploy in a persistent manner U.S. Capabilities and forces into NATO territory, particularly the Baltics and Poland. And that's all very good. I think we're much cleaner on what we understand, and that's NATO and an alliance and military power in a conventional sense. What we don't have a good answer for is Ukraine, Moldova, all these countries that are outside of NATO, where we don't have an alliance, where the threshold that the Russians are putting forward is clearly an attempt, and it's longstanding Russian doctrine, to kind of come in below that area that'll trip us. And how do we respond to that? I don't think there is a clear answer yet in any community as to how we should respond. What worries me, back to your point, is I don't know how hard they're working on that answer, and that concerns me.
Well, that kind of got to the point that I wanted to get to. Is I really think it's a four-part problem. It's bigger than, and the Ukraine's just one of the pieces, right? So I take your point on the Article 5 reassurance and whatever they're calling this thing, a NATO reassurance initiative, which I think is a great thing and ought to be funded, multiple year funding. I think that's something we all ought to look for in the budget this year, and that's helpful. Europeans see that as the guys on the front lines see that as really helpful. But that's kind of a no-brainer, bottom line thing. If you're not going to stand for the Article 5 commitment, why are we here? So I think Ukraine's one part of it. I think you really nailed it. I mean, if there isn't an economic lifeline to Ukraine, you can't sustain that ember. That's a tragedy. But it's bigger than Ukraine. So there's three other parts. The second part is really kind of the psychological, political warfare campaign that Russia that is executing more broadly, everything from RT to funding fascists in Western Europe so that you can claim you're fighting fascism in Western Europe, and funding environmental groups to rail against energy projects which compete with Russian energy projects. So that's a second component, kind of the information war. The third one, as you mentioned, is kind of, it's not just the Ukraine. There's brush fires all along from Georgia on down, and we don't know which one of those could be the next Ukraine. And then the fourth piece is the energy, which is why doesn't the United States have a more free, robust kind of free market energy policy, really pushing the opportunity for liquid natural gas exports, really helping the Europeans think through how you create the north-south connectors, so there are options for dealing with the energy thing. So, when you say I'm disappointed there's no real strategy in the Ukraine, I say, okay, walk across all the other four areas of where Russia is testing itself, and where are we effectively counting on any of them?
But I think what you got to, and what both Kath and Andrew have talked to, but what you got to in your presentation, this lack of a positive vision. I mean, I don't think it was a mistake that the president didn't lay out what we can do with our allies, didn't say the good things. Didn't say, we're really grateful. Even in the context of Iran, you can talk about our allies. But in all sorts of other things, didn't lay out a positive vision about our allies, but also didn't lay out a positive vision about our adversaries. And I mean, at the end of the day, why do you end up talking about sanctions? Because sanctions are pretty easy, actually. I mean, yes, you have to jawbone everybody, and you've got to, but I mean, they make you feel good. They're kind of the cheap, they're the pill, you take for the disease, and it's like, oh my God, I kept giving you those pills. I don't understand, why are you not better? And the answer is, of course, because if you have a systemic problem, you have to have a whole approach. And this is the problem also in the Middle East is, as my boss likes to say to me, you can't beat something with nothing. And this is the challenge that we face in all of these countries is, damn, what about Iraq? Okay, what do you want? Okay, we don't want ISIS. We know we don't want ISIS. What do you want? The president did allude to that. Now, I didn't agree with everything that he said last summer, but I agree with what the way you laid it out, which is, okay, have some ideas, have some benchmarks, have some things you want to help them on that are in a positive direction. Not just, gee, we'd really like you to do a better job killing these people who we all kind of hate, but otherwise, remember, we left in 2011 and that war has ended, so good luck to you and screw you. What about Syria? First of all, what was the vision? The vision was Assad must go. Okay, all right, fine. That's a lot more complicated now. On the other hand, you can't just kind of say, nothing. Hey, what is our vision? What's going to happen? What's going to happen in all of these situations? Even, you know, even the president's antipathy towards Netanyahu, and we're all living through the fun today's, you know, glamorous discussion about who invited him. I don't understand. You didn't do the right thing. Okay. What's the positive vision? What do you want there? What do you want to see in the Gulf? What's the replacement? Rather than, and you know, it was great to talk about the Yemen model, even though it was wrong even when he talked about it. Now the Yemen is a complete, I can't even think of a polite term to describe what's going on in Yemen, but whatever it is, guess what? You know, you can't just not say it. Okay? And that's ultimately the problem that we face in all of these things. There's nothing good to say about our allies, and there's no vision for what is the substitute for some of these really difficult situations. And if your only policy is, I'm going to sanction you, or I'm going to make nice with you. If you're my enemy, if you're a problem, if you're Cuba or Iran, I'm going to suck up to you. If you're our allies, I'm not going to say a word about you. And if you're kind of a problem there in the middle, I'm going to, you know, I'm going to stand tall because that makes me feel good. What is the guidance? You know, what is the not leadership from behind? You've used the word rhetoric repeatedly, and I mean, the message that you're sending is exactly right, which is, you know, at the end of the day, you can't just say, I'm standing tall, I want to lead the world, we have an alliance. If that alliance isn't actually about achieving anything other than, I really need to kill that guy, or wow, we really made Putin squirm, which is not, after all, a grand foreign policy goal, at least it wasn't when I went to grad school. This is a big challenge.
Add one thing on that, which is that, you know, I don't think the answers, just to be clear, to many of these questions, whether it's the Middle East or Russia, are clear. You know, I don't think I could sit here and articulate to you, to answer the question you asked on Ukraine, the exact series of actions the United States should be undertaking that it's not undertaking now that would solve the problem in Ukraine. I certainly can't solve Syria. I can guarantee you that. It's not today, in this period of time. But what I think is the cause of frustration is more that there doesn't seem to be a recognition that that things have shifted, that assumptions have shifted, that the world has shifted, and that it will take significant intellectual energy and effort to figure out the right answer. Instead, it's sort of one foot in front of the other, you know, whether you're inside the administration or on the outside, you know, ankle biting at the administration. You know, if you're me and you're ankle biting, you know, it's take a step, criticize, take a step, criticize, without anyone really having that positive vision. And it's a frustrating time, I think, for anyone who's in foreign policy to try to figure out the right way ahead. And let me just say, for anyone who may have watched today's Senate Armed Services Committee testimony, that was crystal clear. You had General Scowcroft up there, you had Zbigniew Brzezinski up there. They're going to do another one next week with Henry Kissinger and Madeleine Albright. Great discussion, but no clear, oh yeah, this is exactly how you should solve these problems. We clearly do not, as the United States of America, as the world's only superpower, have answers to these questions, and that's a problem.
So just to add to that, I mean, the purpose behind the SASC hearings, it was supposed to start with Henry, I guess he was playing soccer or whatever was he doing? How did he break his shoulder? Anyway, but I mean, there was, other than John just likes to get high-profile people, I mean, they wanted to highlight exactly what you said. They weren't actually looking for answers from them. What they wanted to highlight is we have a strategy problem here. And then take the SASC in the direction of, we're not getting strategy direction action from the White House, and so let's have a deeper view of this. So that was, to me, kind of the prelude to the conversation, not that they were expecting the graybeards to come in and say, well, here's how to solve these things. Is that fair?
I don't know what their intent was, but I think it's a fair depiction of what occurred.
Yeah. Well, I think it's what they were looking for.
What recommendations does this distinguished panel have in terms of resolving the challenge that ISIS poses to our world?
Oh, sure. Are you kidding? I was waiting for the easy question after you got Ukraine. I mean, look, I think I agree with Kath. You know, it wasn't that the president should have said, and the magic formula is, you know, abracadabra, and then everything will be great. I think that we are at a moment where I mean, just sort of straightforwardly and in a perfunctory way, I can't answer your question. Okay, I've been in Washington a very long time, and I've been doing the Middle East for more than 30 years, and I've said this to a colleague today. I said this to Tom. It is the first time in my lifetime that I don't know. You know, I don't have a sense of what the shape of the answer is. It's not that you know how to get there. It's not that you know how the parties are going to behave. It's not that you know that you'll have the will, or that the policies will be right, or that they'll come out right. But in years past, you often had a sense of what the steps are that you could take. And we have gotten into a situation, you know, what Kath called a shift that has been so dramatic that there aren't, you know, the one foot in front of the other. Reactive foreign policy isn't going to work. Let's say, okay, that we decided that we wanted to bring more force to bear, which is what our friends in Iraq want us to do, and what our friends in the Gulf want us to do, and what a lot of our friends in the Middle East want us to do. You know, not to invade, not to reenact the Iraq War, but that we brought more forces, more training, more targeting, more air power, more. A lot more reassurance. Didn't rely on the Iranians as much. Okay, and we pushed back. We actually had some of the successes that the president pretended that we had last night. Then what? Okay. Set aside Iraq, set aside Iraq for a second, because there I think we can actually plot our way forward a little better. What about Syria? Really? So, okay, ISIS is gone. Does that mean Jabhat al-Nusra is okay? Is that the choice now? Is it Jabhat al-Nusra versus the Assads? Or is Assad now okay? Because, of course, the New York Times had a piece earlier this week saying, no, the administration's policy is now, yeah, you know, maybe Assad or Assad light would be okay. You know, some coalition, we could transition. You know, again, not a clear vision. But guess what? How did we get to where we are now? We got there with Assad, and this is the problem with part of the conventional wisdom that I actually see. Actually, among conservatives a lot lately is, well, no, what we really need is a bunch more, you know, Mubaraks and Saddams and those guys, the secular strongmen. They're going to solve the problem in the Middle East. And it's like, where were you 3-4 years ago? And don't you remember how we got here? Having a nastier guy is not a long-term solution to this problem. Okay, I've very successfully said all the ways in which we aren't going to solve this problem. And of course the answer is that this requires a multi-dimensional, multi-year, multinational effort that actually has an end game in sight. You know, if the end game is we just really need a better Sisi, or, you know, or a less creepy Mubarak, or a less obvious Saddam, then that's not a vision, because that's not sustainable. You need a vision in which this part of the world looks like a part of the world that we want to be in. Okay, and then you have to walk backwards. How do you get there? Guess what? It's not going to be in this president's term or the next president's term, but it requires a diplomatic vision. It requires having people you want to work with. We don't have anybody we want to work with. Has anybody noticed? We don't have allies on the ground. We're training the moderate Syrian opposition, maybe starting in the spring, but we really don't like them or trust them. You know, who's going to fill the vacuum once we get rid of the bad guys? All of these things require having a complicated vision. And guess what? You know, just to step back to Barack Obama for 1 second, you're right, it is complicated. You're right, the president can't get out there and talk about all of this crap and expect it not to take up the whole State of the Union. On the other hand, he's a smart guy. He's a thoughtful guy. The fact that we're not thinking about this, the fact that we're not leading, that we're not convening other nations to talk about this, that they're not talking to outsiders about this, because they're not in any serious way, is really a problem.
I think the way forward is clearer than that, and I think you have to start with where you went wrong. And this isn't a partisan comment. It really isn't. I work at a nonpartisan think tank, I swear. But I think you have to go back to You have to go back to Quran. You have to go back to 2010 and 2011. I mean, if you look at the first part of President Obama's first term, we all said it was Bush light, and in many ways, it actually was Bush light. The policies were very, very consistent, and when the president came out with his counterterrorism strategy in 2011, it was not just another it was significantly and consciously different, and it very much narrowed and focused how the counterterrorism fight was going to happen, and the goal was going to be go after core Al-Qaeda and any organizations that were affiliated with Al-Qaeda, which were actively operationally planning attacks in the United States. So it greatly collapsed the scope of the operations. The focus was much more kinetic and hunting people. It incorporated in that the withdrawals from Iraq and Afghanistan as part of that. That strategy has been, I give the credit, the president has followed that strategy, and I think we've gone consistently downhill since 2011. So how do you turn this around, and how do you win? I actually think it's kind of simpler than that. You have, first of all, the problem is what we have now, in a sense, a global Islamist insurgency. We have groups which are not only thriving, but are actually connecting together. The fact that you can walk on stepping stones from al-Shabaab to Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula to Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb to Boko Haram, that's not a good thing. So the first thing I think you'd have to do is, one is you have to put crushing defeat on these guys somewhere, because you have to destroy the narrative that this is a winning, growing movement. You have to go back the way bin Laden was disgraced in 2001 when he was kicked out of Afghanistan. So you have to win, and you have to win decisively in places that are really important to you. And then as part of that winning, you have to kind of start to disaggregate this network that's grown together. So I think that you have to start in Iraq and Afghanistan. In Iraq, you've got to kick ISIS out of Iraq. You've got to defeat them, crush them, and kick them out of Iraq. Some of them may scurry back to Syria. But you have to drive them from the land to prove that, no, once again, for the third time, we liberated this country. And in Afghanistan, you have to not lose Afghanistan. I think those are absolutely vital. And then I think the third thing is you demonstrate there are places where you can win and grow. We've got relatively easy pickings in Tunisia, Morocco, relatively easy. Egypt and Jordan, countries that can thrive and grow, not just, I don't think, have new Mubaraks, but actually have something that looks more civil society, economic freedom, and defeating extremism the way we would like. So we could do a positive engagement there. We could win the war in Iraq. We could not lose the war in Afghanistan, and that would be a hell. And I think the other thing is really have to start to go after the foreign fighter pipelines. And I think if we did those actions, that would be awesome. But here's the thing, which is, it's a wonderful conversation, but it's meaningless. And this is the point I think none of those things are possible without a president that doesn't want to do them. None of them are going to happen.
And what happens? And do we sustain? I mean, again, I don't mind that as an interim step, but guess what? There was a reason why Barack Obama won the election, and we can't forget that, know.
Okay, well, look, we can forget that, right? I think we can. Right?
I want to forget it, but I can't.
I think that does take it completely out of perspective. There was a lot of anger, but there was also a recession. So it really was kind of a nightmare scenario, and it was, 2 terms of republic. So it was kind of a nightmare scenario. But the notion of the counterterrorism strategy was all wrong, and that's why the president lost, and people wouldn't stand for that. I don't think that's fair.
No, let me just, I mean, I think there's it's funny, when you were talking, the piece, I agree with a lot of what you said, because that's the world that I come from, and so that's a perfectly reasonable sort of crush the enemy strategy. I think it's valid. I think if you combine it with the 37-year perspective, if you will, that a lot of the underlying political and societal things that have to change are going to be generational at best, if not multi-generational. That's all true. Here's the thing. The thing is, Americans don't want to spend the money.
Oh, I totally disagree with that. That is
they don't want to spend the money.
You look at the poll numbers right now, and the polls for support for U.S. operations in Iraq and Afghanistan are going up, not down.
I don't agree with you, Kath, in this regard. I think that Americans will, when the problem is very great, Americans will go. The problem is sustaining, and this is where what I talked about is relevant, because the problem is that doing what you want, which is strategically viable, I think, it's not sustainable.
Yeah, but look, in Vietnam, we lost the war in '68. We don't pull out of Vietnam until '73. and we don't pull the plug on Vietnam until 75, and that was in one of the worst economies of the post-World War II era. And a president sustained war for 6 years after nobody thought it was winnable. No, I'm not just saying I think this is grossly unfair to the American people to kind of heap the blame on them, right? Because we have a task to do, and because it's moderately hard to say, well, we can't do the practical, rational thing because the American people won't sustain that. I just think that's defeatist talk. I just don't think it's true.
Well, okay.
I think it's just Washington talking to itself.
I'll be the defeatist in the crowd. Look, I completely agree with Danielle. When push comes to shove, Americans absolutely come around. It usually takes push coming to shove. So the question is, what is the equivalent of that?
Explain to me how Americans could tolerate 6 more years of the war in Vietnam when they hated it.
Let me finish what I'm saying. One of the things that has changed inside Washington is the composition of the Republican Party itself. And inside the Republican Party, you no longer have a single clear pro-defense, big spending on national security constituency. Instead, you have at least 2 constituencies, one of which is very strongly internally focused in budget hawks. Now, that's happened through American history. Do I think it will pass? Absolutely. The question is, will it pass on a time frame that supports what you're talking about in the next 2 years?
And the answer is absolutely yes. Absolutely yes. But again, absent presidential leadership, we'll never know because it'll never happen. So it's a mute discussion. But the point is I think this notion that somehow the politics aren't right for this, and this is why it can't be done, is absolutely just Washington convincing itself it's just not to do it. It has nothing to do with the state of the American people. And I go back to Vietnam. Not that that was a good way to fight a war, but the American people paid for a war they thought was lost for 6 years. Did they not notice the war was still going on for 6 years? I mean, come on. If President Obama wanted to fight in Iraq and Afghanistan, the American people would be with him. They may not like it, but they would pay for it.
Yeah, I don't think it was a money question, by the way. I think it's not much less about money than it is about sort of a general distaste for these long-term presence without a clear set of goals, and that's another challenge that we face.
Yeah, I certainly don't disagree with what you're saying. What I will say, given your counterterrorism example, because you chose to use that in the years from 2011 forward, is if you're sitting in and among the senior military leadership of this country, and you're looking at Boko Haram, AQAP, AQAM, ISIS, Russia, China, you can't help but think about the money. Because you don't know how, without leadership, which I agree with, you don't know how to prioritize that, and you're very concerned about how to make the capabilities sufficient across all of that in the time in which the political interest on Capitol Hill and in the White House is not there to support you doing so.
Fair enough, but AQAP, AQIM, Boko Haram, and even al-Shabaab were largely marginalized until Libya. And the way we left Libya created the space for all this to happen.
Well, the way we left everywhere has created the space for this.
Libya
We're
and
about
Iraq.
to do that in Afghanistan. I mean,
fair enough.
Right.
Well, I would like you all in a traditional way to put both your hands together and praise these 4 individuals for being as candid as they have been here on this stage tonight. Thank you so very much indeed.
Thank you for joining us for World Affairs Today, a production of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Stay connected with us at www.worldaffairstoday.org.